This is the story of how I transformed a barn into the home we always wanted, with a character and details that suit our unique personalities and hobbies. I'll walk you through what I did and why I did it. Though I was my own architect, contractor, superintendent, carpenter, and often laborer, I had a great crew helping me, and I couldn't have done it without all their help. After living nearly 3 decades in Washington, D.C., my husband Greg and I were ready for a change. I got the harebrained idea to build a house in the woods near Culpeper, Virginia. To the surprise of no one who knows me, I decided to go fully custom and do it myself. This was a journey with a lot of challenges, but a lot of reward. I knew from the beginning that I would want to document my journey via video, and this video is for friends and family who have asked for some behind the scenes. This video is also for those of you who found me online and want a little bit more information about me before you work with me as your realtor. And if no one is interested in watching this video, still for Cheska and me. I've condensed a 4-year project into about a 24-minute video. I know people have no attention span these days. There are chapters in the description if you're interested in skipping around. I start with the question of how did I come up with this design, and then I progress through retrofitting the old barn to meet residential building code. I show building the structure with a few complexities such as the tower roof and underpinning the barn foundation. Then we move up to the tower roof and I show you how I installed a vegetated roof on top of the tower. Then I get into a lot of the custom interior details, including concrete countertops, light tray, a lot of custom woodwork, and trains. I briefly talk a little bit about the land, including removing the highly invasive autumn olive, and then I wrap up with the most important and the most unusual room, the train room. This video is not sponsored. I don't even know how to do that, but I'm going to include several relevant links in the description. We wanted to be away from the city. I found 10 acres of mature hardwood forest at the end of a gravel road in the middle of nowhere. Perfect. Even better, there was a 30-foot by 40-foot barn. I don't know if it was a barn or a garage, but I'll call it a barn. It was just a concrete floor, concrete block walls, and a truss roof. Nothing more. Bare bones, but structurally sound. This was during COVID, and due to supply chain issues, I wanted to get all my materials up front, and this would allow me a place to store all that. But what are we going to do with this? First step was to measure everything and then figure out where I'd add on. Because I knew I would need to add on, I sketched up a concept for adding on to the front. So what am I going to do with this? How am I going to make this dump into a fully functioning home? Then I started blocking and massing, basically space planning. I'm including this in the video because a lot of people ask me the question of how did I come up with this design? I'll walk you through the full process. It's short and simple. The existing barn was 30 by 40, and the only logical use for that space was trains. A bit of context here. This is my husband, Greg, and he is a train freak. He'd collect full-size trains if that were feasible, but he collects Lionel O-Gauge trains. He's wanted a large train room for at least the last 20 years, and as we approached 50, I decided that I needed to do everything possible to ensure that he got it, because I wanted him to have a few decades to enjoy it, not just wait until we're old. So this became a mission. So back to space planning. The first floor of the barn is 100% trains. Above that is a loft that works great for a bedroom. Due to the sloped ceiling, the space wouldn't subdivide easily, so it ends up being a huge bedroom, so I'll say bedroom plus. Addition in the front, slightly wider than the barn, which helps with detailing and aesthetics. Ceiling height of the first floor is constrained by the barn loft. Then a second level, same footprint as the first, but the ceiling height here can be higher. I definitely wanted to keep plumbing limited to a small part of the house. I put circulation on the opposite side of the plumbing. Kitchen and bath are the 2 spaces that need plumbing, and we were okay with only a second level bathroom. This is just a small house for the 2 of us. Utility space logically goes on the same side as plumbing, which is also the less visible side of the house. The front door location became obvious, and then the only unclaimed space became a living area, and that was fine for us upstairs. And for the roof, based on my green infrastructure and landscape background, of course I made this flat to create a roof deck. At this point I was happy with the overall layout, but how is it going to look and how am I going to build it? I started with this photo. I drew an elevation in AutoCAD and dropped it in. I decided to go with stucco for the finish. I had experience with stucco, and I kind of like the imperfections of stucco. What I really love about it is that it's like frosting a cake without any of the lines that you get in siding or brick. I drew in a placeholder landscape, and I thought I was done. But there was one significant problem. I initially forgot to add access up to the roof. So I added a tower to get to the roof. This is the point that my conventional stairs changed to spiral stairs. I first drew the tower with a flat roof, but it was I added a peak until the roof looked right to me, which was about 60 degrees. Pretty steep. Then I debated for months over what type of roofing to use on the tower roof. I ended up going with a vegetative roof, and I'll show you that in detail in this video. When I drew plants in the rendering, the peak of the roof really seemed to soften and round out, which I didn't care for so much. So I added an orb about 5 feet above the roof peak, and that was the final touch. The last step of design was sourcing discount doors, windows, and cabinets, and then updating the design with those dimensions. Fortunately, during COVID, Southern Sales Services was open. This is a building materials auction house in Baltimore. I learned once before that if you're buying doors, windows, and cabinets at auction, it's helpful to secure them before you finalize the design because you never know exactly what sizes you're going to be able to get. But if you want to save many tens of thousands of dollars, it's totally worth it. I fell in love with these rustic hickory cabinets, and those set the tone for much of the woodwork down the line. I did a full mock-up of the kitchen in the barn. It was like a life-size version of Tetris. I only needed to order 3 small pieces, unfortunately at full price, to complete the design. I measured and labeled every single piece and stored them in the barn until the kitchen was ready. So I updated the facade using the exact doors and windows and got the energy information off their stickers and used that in my permit application. If you're going to retrofit a non-residential building to meet residential building code, you need to understand how much work is involved. For this barn, we needed to remove part of the roof to heavy up trusses where the old building meets new. The roof trusses, though structurally sound, didn't allow nearly enough space for insulation. So we had to fur out all the trusses to make room and then filled that with mineral wool insulation. The barn didn't have any footings, and building code requires that your foundation be 2 feet below grade. So I needed to waterproof and bury the bottom 2 feet of the walls. Where the new building meets old, we had to underpin the existing slab. Yep, hand digging under the slab and pouring concrete footings down there in multiple phases to prevent collapse of the old barn. But then after that, we continued with the addition footing, and then 30 yards of concrete later, we were exhausted, but we had a foundation. Quick logistics consideration for the tower roof. The tower roof involves a lot of compound miter cuts, and it's about 30 to 40 feet off the ground with no real working space. So I built the entire tower roof in the barn on casters. I built the whole damn thing in there. Plumbing, electric, insulation, ceiling, gutter, waterproofing, you name it. Then once the slab for the addition was in place, we rolled it out, and I used a 40-foot lull to get it out of the way until we were framed up. During construction, driving this lull was often the highlight of my day. I sent this sketch to a local welder and ordered the stainless steel orb from Amazon. Framing was pretty conventional. I used 2x6 walls. I would never recommend building a new home with 2x4s. 2x6s are much more sound. For sheathing, I used the zip system. When I ran the numbers on that, it was actually less expensive than using plain OSB and Tyvek and far, far easier. And then we set the tower roof in place. On the old barn, we built an integral gutter with more substantial soffits, and I'm really happy with how that looks. Stucco took 5 or 6 weeks. I took this photo one day when I realized that the house was finally starting to look like my rendering. For stucco, I used Type S mortar in 3 coats with lamp black pigment in the final coat. There's a 3-story glass block window at the stair tower. We installed this concurrent with the stucco as it uses the same mortar. We installed only 1 course each morning, let it firm up, and then 1 course each afternoon. This one window took over 2 weeks, and there's a lot of steel reinforcement between the courses. Glass block has always been one of my favorite building materials, but I had a lot of challenges in getting it permitted. Let's go up to the roof. The roof deck is dead flat, 0 slope. with an EPDM membrane and 2 roof drains. EPDM is basically a pond liner, and I ordered a large enough roll to do this without any seams. I plugged the roof drains and flood tested the roof for about 2 weeks to ensure that it was totally watertight. Notice how the parapet walls slope at the top edge. That's to fit planters all the way to the edge of the walls. The roof deck is literally floating on top. Nothing is anchored because you don't want to puncture the membrane. First, I put down 4 inches of rigid foam insulation, then 2x6 joist, and then finished it off with Trex decking. The inside walls are 2x4s clad with Trex. Aluminum screening is for bee prevention. These walls provide places for lights, electrical outlets, and a propane connection. And of course, they support planters all the way around the roof deck. I added a shade sail and misting fan so the space isn't scorching hot in the summer. It is really nice at night. And on a clear day, we can see the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'll show you how I did the tower roof. This is capillary fabric from Conservation Technology in Baltimore. In a prior career, I used to test these products, and this material has the highest capillary pull of any fabric that I've ever seen. I cut out triangular pieces to wrap the pyramid-shaped roof. I got a sturdy tree climbing harness from a local arborist supply, and then anchored myself to the roof. For good measure, I added a second layer of Grace Ice and Water Shield, that's my waterproofing on the tower, before proceeding with the next layers. Directly on top of the waterproofing is a layer of 1-inch foam rigid insulation. That's a protection layer. You could just barely see the green insulation in this gap between the plywood. I just duct taped it in place so that nothing penetrates the waterproofing. On top of that insulation is 3/4 inch exterior grade plywood. That's so that I have a surface to anchor to. By using screws that are no longer than 1 inch, the insulation below prevents any screw tips from puncturing the membrane. Then I wrapped the pyramid roof in the triangular sheets of capillary fabric that you saw a little while ago. Then I attached multiple strips of capillary fabric on top of that to make pockets. I screwed all the capillary fabric to the plywood. Almost done. I wove 1/4 inch drip irrigation tubing through the entire system and stuffed the pockets with a mix of horticultural mineral wool and green roof soil. Then plant and wait. I know from experience that it can take some time to get full plant coverage in this challenging environment, so I'm being patient. If you're planning to buy land to build a home, then you probably won't have any utilities to start with. Be sure to line up well, septic, and electric early. The well is fastest as you only need a well permit. You don't need to build anything else before you install the well. And you won't need septic until you have a house with working plumbing. For electric, we ran generators until we had the permanent circuit panel, which means after the house was closed in. Once we had water and lights, it felt like everything was finally coming together. Before we look around at interior details, let me fill you in a little bit on my concept of this home. As a realtor, I can provide you advice on resale value, but a home is more than resale value. Design and construction piqued my interest in my earliest childhood memories. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with historic mansions, and that drove my parents crazy. I was super interested in my grandmother's house, which my grandfather built with his own hands. My uncle bought a historic home and completely renovated it. I helped him, and I loved every bit of that process. I've always loved taking things apart and putting them back again, including things like doors, windows, walls, and ceilings. When I was a kid, I would crawl under crawl spaces of houses to see how the foundations were built. We lived in one house that had tree stumps under the house, and I thought that was really cool. I remember when building materials were meant to last centuries, and they often told a story and caused me to think, and they still do. So whether or not my craftsmanship is perfect, or if I've built anything that anyone else would want, beyond meeting some basic functional criteria, I wanted a home that delights and engages the mind. My mind, at least. So come on in. We love to cook and entertain, and we know that everyone always hangs out in the kitchen, so we planned for that. I'll walk you through a few details in here, including the light tray, the concrete countertops, and some custom woodwork, and the table. My assistant Cheska is here for the tour. The spiral stairs were easy. This was a made-to-order kit from Paragon Stairs. The link is in the description. The light tray started with 2x6s hanging from joist with steel brackets. I pre-finished the ceiling paneling, I wanted the kitchen to be 100% wood, tile, and plants. No drywall in the kitchen. Because you can partially see through the glue chip glass I chose, I sponge painted the ceiling, added some crystals, and lined the inside with foil tape. I also added rope lights around the edge. I built the entire light tray trim and frame using materials that a friend and I salvaged from a local cabinet company. The trim wasn't uniform in color, so I mixed gold dust with polyurethane to even it out. Now we're ready to hang it. I ended up hinging it on one side, then we put the glass panels in, and then finally raised it into place. It's really heavy, and I ended up reinforcing it with multiple steel brackets. I'm totally cool with mixing wood species, and the trim here is hickory and maple with cherry corners. The light tray cast a really even light, in addition to the under cabinet task lighting. Most of our guests ask us about the concrete countertops. After a lot of research, I ended up using Concrete Countertop Solutions. For their system, line the cabinet tops with tile backer board. They sell snap-off edging, and you can even use that on curves. At appliance edges, like the stove and the fridge, they recommend just a plywood edge like this, but I think I would do it better if I had to do it over again. They also sell reinforcement grid and all the accessories that you'll need. Link is in the description. At the sink, I wanted an integral drain board like you see on old farmhouse sinks. I used leftover PEX pipe and 12-gauge wire to make a mold in the shape that I wanted. I made my own sink blockouts, and I definitely want a do-over on those, but they turned out good enough. The concrete is sand mix mixed with Concrete Countertop Solutions acrylic fibers. We mixed up concrete in multiple colors, but by the time you're done troweling, they blend together, so I wouldn't bother. I got better results on coloring from an acid stain after the concrete cured. My friend Ian helped me pour the concrete. This is just after the pour, then we cover it and let it cure overnight. The only place I really notice the pre-blended color variation is right at the edge, and that's cool. The drain board grooves needed the most amount of work. The real work is grinding and finishing. We started with a concrete grinding bit, which removed about a 1/16 inch of material and exposed a lot of aggregate. Then we progressed from a 50 grit up to a 6,000 grit diamond sanding pad. I definitely think it's best to sand wet and wear an appropriate mask or a respirator. The 6,000 grit pads get you a surface like glass. Apply epoxy and you get this. I got a little epoxy on the backsplash tile, but I treated all the tile with shine and seal, and that blended it all together. We're so happy with the double drain board. We use a dirty side and a clean side. Overall, super happy with the result. Let's take a look at some woodwork. I joined together 2 tents to make a woodwork shop. These worked great until we got a really heavy snow. Even though I bought the cabinets pre-assembled, I did a fair amount of custom woodwork to tie everything together. One example is the back side of these 2 cabinets by the front door. Whenever possible, I build pieces as completed units in the woodwork shop. I tend to glue and screw the joints. I also usually tape whenever I glue inside corners. Here it is installed. I used a lot of salvaged wood, often laminating pieces into slabs. They look pretty horrible until they're sanded. This piece is for trim around the living wall. I like to assemble as much as I can on the bench because I find the joints come out a lot cleaner that way. Here it is in place. The tabletop was actually a pretty easy project. I had all these leftover teak triangles. To reinforce them, I built a pine base, which you don't see unless you climb under the table. I usually glue and clamp with a few screws, but in this case I really couldn't clamp, so I used a lot of screws. Because I screwed from the bottom, I marked the joints to ensure I always landed a safe distance from the edge of each piece. Glued up, it looks horrible, but the glue sands off really easy if you wipe off most of the excess while it's wet. I made a jig to spin the router in a perfect circle, and here it is sanded and finished. Behind this door is the train room. Of course I built the door. This is a rubber wood countertop reinforced on both sides with white oak strips and hung with barn door hardware. Stay tuned for trains. Going upstairs, here's the loft we started with. My friends Ed and Lucas helped me paint a mural on the walls and ceiling of the bedroom. We did this really early on because I knew the painting would be a terrible mess. We used a lot of spray paint. Not all the windows were in yet, and one night bats decided to fly in. I convinced them to fly out. I do love that we have bats here because they eat so many mosquitoes. I wanted the bedroom to have a calming feel, and I think we did that. You see those little doors off to the side? Those are closet doors. outdoors. I built shelves in the leftover triangular space. After these photos, I trimmed everything out nice, but now they're full of clothes, so you get to see it unfinished. I built the doors in my workshop. These are hickory frames with birch butcher block slabs. I used glass door pulls like my grandmother had. Before we move on to the living room, I'd like to mention my local lumber yard. I bought nearly all the hardwood for my house from C.P. Johnson in Elkwood, Virginia. They carry a huge selection of hardwood lumber and veneered plywood, not framing lumber. This is wood for furniture and trim work. They sell it rough cut, but they do offer planing and joining. Their prices are great. Their product is all over my house, and I couldn't have pulled this off without them. Of course, I built my own custom bifold doors. I wanted to keep this opening 8-foot height, and I didn't want the doors to take up too much room when they're open. These are maple veneer plywood with maple trim. Lots of clamps. One of my favorite projects is the railing and column in the living room. I wanted this to have a lot of character, be really substantial, and it's useful to have a place to rest things temporarily right at the top of the stairs. I found a photo of this sketch. I probably did 100 sketches like this. This sketch is for that Luan template, and from that template, I made this maple base. Then a frame for the railing spindles. I laid the spindles out in a herringbone pattern using very uniformly cut 2x4 spacers. Then I labeled each piece and set them aside. Then I whipped out my collection of clamps, reassembled and glued it all up. Ta-da! Herringbone pattern spindles that meet code. These spindles are also entirely salvaged wood. Here the spindles are in place over the maple base plate. Next up is the column trim. This is 4-quarter walnut on the corners and ambrosia maple in the middle. I glued and sanded 2 L-shaped pieces and then joined them together after fitting around the column. Finally, I trimmed out the railing in the same ambrosia maple. This is roof level in the tower. Most of this trim is hickory with a little bit of teak and cherry. At the top of the tower, I used oak, padauk, ambrosia maple, walnut, curly maple, and hickory. The ceiling is pine with cedar accents. I had a lot of sketches like this one that I drew on the wall. Doing this work in the tower required some logistics that were pretty complicated. Those cornices I showed you in the previous shots, you can see some right there. Those are not just decorative. Those are places to rest scaffolding. This scaffolding is at the roof level or 3rd floor level, and this is real time of me squeezing up through a very tiny opening. From there, I can reach most of the tops of the windows. Then on top of that scaffolding is a ladder going to another level of scaffolding so that I can work on the tower ceiling. I had to carry up lumber this way, 1 board at a time. Sometimes the same board up and down 3 or 4 times just to get a perfect fit. This shot is just after polyurethane on the ceiling. I started finishes way up here and then bit by bit worked my way down. I built window trim on a bench and then installed each as a single unit. I had been saving wood scraps as I went, and by this point I decided to use a lot of it to build some furniture. Yeah, I know, I don't need quite so much glue. It was too cold outside for either glue or polyurethane, so I assembled and finished in the living room. The 5-bay window is a combination of hickory and padauk. The furniture I built uses only glue, no screws. The scrap boards I used were planed to different thicknesses, which I think adds to the character. I wanted each room to have its own theme, and the idea for the living room was always about natural wood and light. We find this a pretty enjoyable space. Quick peek inside the bathroom. We're obviously not completely done in here. The vanity is detailed the same as the kitchen, concrete countertops. And if you have the space to do a large vanity like this, I highly recommend it. This is the first bathroom I ever had with a water closet, and the privacy is great. My favorite feature is the shower. One day, if we need a wheelchair accessible shower, this is it. It is walk-in, curbless, spacious, has a bench, love it. And when deciding where to put your washer and dryer, close to the bedroom is the best spot. Only the train room is left, but I wouldn't do this project justice without covering the setting. We're in a beautifully wooded part of the Virginia Piedmont within eye shot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We love the land and the people here. And before putting roots down somewhere, I think those are important criteria to consider. Though most of our land is healthy, mature hardwood forest, a big chunk of it was choked out by highly invasive autumn olive. Autumn olive over-enriches the soil with nitrogen, making the soil hospitable to itself, but killing off most of the competition. Over the past few years, I've been removing the olive and trying to encourage natives, but this is a multi-year project, and sometimes this involves controlled burns. If you're going to buy land, I think it's important to consider how big of a project you're going to take on and whether you will enjoy that project. I've only gotten a small portion of the landscape in good shape so far, like this bed that includes a lot of native ferns and flowers that I salvaged from harm's way. On to the most important room, the train room. We could be working on this the next few decades and not finish it, and that's kind of the point. Remember that this started as a barn that didn't meet any residential building code. We waterproofed the floor to create a vapor barrier. Then we installed a 1-inch thick grid and filled the voids with rigid foam insulation. This was all to bring it up to building code. Greg designed a train layout. As a first step, I outlined platforms on the floor. The caution tape marks each screw that was a center point of a circle. Then I started building short little stud walls. These are so short because the wall faces will be shelves, and I'll show you that. Once the wall base was in, I lined the inside of the walls with 1/4-inch OSB or 1/8-inch Luan where it was really tight. Now you can see what's going on with those short studs. The wall faces are lined with shelves, and to get the cantilever of the shelves to work, they're built like multi-story buildings. Then we framed up the actual platforms. The walls I showed at first aren't really structural. The platforms are primarily supported by beams, columns, and ledger boards. And of course, the trains need it perfectly level in all directions. Below the platforms is a lot of space for wiring and storage. Cheska's touring here. The outside is a lower level, and the middle level is in the center. Eventually, there will be one more level. Here you can see that we clad the studs that are supporting those shelves. Here's how I did that. I pre-finished 1/8-inch Luan panels with a range of blue-green wood stains and then cut those into strips. I used 1/4-inch thick oak strips stained dark blue at each joint. My next-door neighbor is an upholsterer, and he helped me make some flexible trim for the top edge. Making the upholstery buttons took the longest. Time to lay track! This double switchover was the first piece installed. Here's Greg building a 16-track freight yard, but those windows need some trim. Given the train theme in Greg's home state of Pennsylvania, the window trim is a keystone. I used red oak, and the keystone on top is blonde hickory for contrast. One major element in the train layout is a turntable. First, I cut out the hole. We planned on this early on to avoid any beam conflict. And here is a severely sped up shot of the turntable and roundhouse in action. I hope you enjoyed this journey, or at least parts of it. Please leave a comment about any parts that you liked, or if you have any different experiences with some of these things, or if you have any questions. I made 2 other videos about my background, which I link at the end of this video. Home is really important to me, and that's why I'm glad that my profession involves helping people find a home, get the most out of their home, and obviously I love helping people find a great fixer-upper. I will not be doing any more videos like this one. Turns out that converting 4 years worth of photos and videos into a cohesive narrative is exhausting. I will be continuing with videos about real estate, specifically the Virginia Piedmont and the Shenandoah Valley. So if you're interested in that content, please subscribe.